Putin's running out of soldiers. So what does he do? Well, he goes to the one country where there's even worse human rights than there are in Russia, in North Korea, and he says he says to his friend Kim, we need some cannon fodder, and Kim says, yeah, great. And by the way, can you send me some money and perhaps nuclear secrets or whatever else they're cooking up over there? And he ends up getting more soldiers. Now, on one hand, the Chinese, Xi, doesn't want to expand the war. On the other hand, he's not micromanaging Putin. They're all sort of players in their own right, and he can make suggestions and so on. But I think that at the end of the day, what this move shows is Putin's desperation. And the one thing Putin can't have, and this is really important, is if he does a general conscription, if he says that we're going to go out and just draft regular people off the street, if he does that, then he's afraid, and very afraid, that the Russian people will no longer tolerate what's going on.
Hello and welcome to Frontline for Times Radio with me, Kate Gerbeau. And today we are talking to the financier and political activist Bill Browder. Bill is the founder and CEO of Hermitage Capital Management and was the largest foreign investor in Russia until 2005, when he was banned from the country for exposing corruption. He now campaigns to impose sanctions against corrupt people linked to the Putin regime and to free political activists. Bill Browder, great to see you again. And this is the first time that we have actually spoken since the release of your friend, Vladimir Kara-Murza. We've often spoken about him while he was incarcerated in Russia, and it was a day we thought we would never see. I'm looking forward to having a sit-down chat with both of you very, very soon. Can you tell me, though, just now, how he is and what he's up to?
Well, so Vladimir Kara-Murza was my friend and ally who helped pass the Magnitsky Act all around the world to freeze Russian assets. Putin hated his guts, tried to kill him twice with poison, and then sentenced him to 25 years in prison in Siberia, where he served in solitary confinement in a cell barely bigger than a closet, where he couldn't talk to people for a full year. He was in really bad shape, and I was really starting to despair. I thought he would die in custody, and I spent the last 2.5 years coming on your show and everyone else's show and meeting with politicians and doing everything I could to raise his profile and advocate for his release. And remarkably and unbelievably, he was included in that prisoner swap on August 1st this summer. And it was a moment of just unbelievable greatness that he was released and his life was saved. He came out in not particularly great shape. He had lost a huge amount of weight. He looked like he had been in a concentration camp. But psychologically, he was absolutely the same Vladimir we always knew. And literally from the day that he got out of prison until now, he's been on the road advocating for the release of other political prisoners, to fight the Putin regime, to stop the war in Ukraine. And he's met with presidents and prime ministers all over the world. And he's now effectively elevated himself to becoming I would say, the most important opposition politician in Russia right now.
Really looking forward to meeting him with you very soon. On the situation in Russia at the moment, I'm interested in getting your perspective on the state of the Russian economy and whether you agree with the theory that Russia will sue for peace in 2025 because the money's going to run out.
Well, I've always thought that the sanctions are worse than Russia has admitted to. The sanctions have been very punishing. And they've punished themselves with this war. The current statistics are that they're spending somewhere around 40% of their budget on military expenditures, 40% of the government budget, which is estimated to be around 6% of their GDP. I was just looking at figures this morning that says that's a very narrowly defined view. And in fact, they're spending about 10% of GDP and perhaps 80% of their or close to 80% of their budget on military expenditures. And basically, Russia doesn't have that. The financial resources are running out. Where do they get the money to do this? They get the money from the sale of oil, and they get the money from their savings in what they're called their national wealth fund. Their national wealth fund is depleting like crazy. And at the moment, oil is the only thing keeping them afloat. If for some reason oil prices were to drop, they'd be out of business. And so, suing for peace, I don't think is actually going to happen. I think that Putin needs this war in order to stay in power. He's ready to starve the Russian people if necessary to keep the war going. He's like Kim Jong-un of North Korea, where his whole reason for having this war is a war where people are distracted from their anger towards him, so they can be angry towards a foreign enemy. And so Putin can't afford not to have this war. So no matter how bad the economy is, I think you're going to see Putin carrying on, because any sign of weakness, he could end up losing power.
And hosting the recent BRICS summit in Russia, President Putin called for an alternative to SWIFT, the international payment system. He wants to de-dollarize the world, saying the US is using it as a political weapon, the dollar. He's not getting very far, though, is he? It must be hurting.
Well, I mean, it's the whole thing was absurd. So who's part of BRICS? So Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, and then a few other random countries. These are not countries where any normal person would want to keep their money. You don't want to keep your money in China because they'll confiscate it. You don't want to keep it in Brazil because it'll inflate away. You don't want to keep it in Russia under any circumstances. And so it's not as if there's any combined currency that people are going to say, oh, wow, this is better than the dollar. And in fact, if you look at the statistics, the dollar has become a more pervasive currency over the last few years than it was before. And so it's a complete fantasy of Putin. Nobody's going to be buying BRIC products with BRICS currency at any point that we can imagine. It's all the whole idea of BRICS is kind of an absurd construct, which actually came into effect for the oddest reason. There was a research analyst at Goldman Sachs like 15 years ago. His name is Jim O'Neill, and he came up with this idea, the BRICS, as just sort of an interesting idea for a research report, a stock research report, and he put it out there, and then it kind of caught on as a financial term, and so people were saying, "Oh, we want to invest in the BRICS." That was a time when all the countries were looking more prominent and positive, and then it became a term, and then it became a political concept after that. But you should know that these countries have nothing to do with each other, really. I mean, so China, yes, is supporting Russia a little bit in buying their oil and supplying cars and phones and so on. India buys a little bit of their oil, but it's not like these countries are sort of natural trading partners. They've never been particularly natural allies, and so the idea that this is some type of sort of natural political association is really not at all the case. It's a total artificial construct.
And at the BRICS summit, Bill, perhaps surprisingly, President Xi has a warning not to expand the war in Ukraine, clearly in reference to North Korean troops. And we've heard a lot why North Korean involvement would upset President Xi. But the question remains, why would Putin risk whatever alliance he does have with China? Is this part of Kremlin dark strategy, or is Putin really just an agent of chaos?
Well, I think first and foremost, why does he have North Korean troops there? It's very simple, because he's burned through Russian troops. According to Ukrainian estimates, the number of dead Russian soldiers is now closing in on 700,000 dead Russian soldiers. And it's just not that easy for them in Russia to get more soldiers. And he needs more soldiers because that's the only way that he can continue to sort of bombard and invade Ukraine. And so Putin's going around, and by the way, the sign-on bonus for a Russian soldier has gone up by tenfold. It's gone from like $4,000 to $40,000 to be a soldier to go and die in war, because they're just running out of people. They've cleared out their prisons. It used to be that if you're a prisoner, you could get out of your sentence by being a soldier, and so they cleared out all the prisons. They've now made it something where even if you're under criminal investigation, you can get rid of that criminal investigation by becoming a soldier. They're looking for soldiers anywhere and everywhere they can. And so Putin's running out of soldiers. So what does he do? Well, he goes to the one country where there's even worse human rights than there are in Russia, in North Korea, and he says to his friend Kim, we need some cannon fodder. And Kim says, yeah, great. And by the way, can you send me some money and perhaps nuclear secrets or whatever else they're cooking up over there? And he ends up getting more soldiers. And now, on one hand, the Chinese, Xi doesn't want to expand the war. On the other hand, he's not micromanaging Putin. They're all sort of players in their own right, and he can make suggestions and so on. But I think that at the end of the day, what this move shows is Putin's desperation. And the one thing Putin can't have, and this is really important, is if he does a general conscription. If he says that we're going to go out and just draft regular people off the street, if he does that, then he's afraid, and very afraid, that the Russian people will no longer tolerate what's going on. So far they have, but that would be the red line, the point too far.
So clearly you see the relationship with North Korea as one of desperation. Is that right?
Definitely desperation. I mean, this is the most isolated, alienated country in the world. They're on every sanctions list. They're a sort of rogue regime. The fact that Putin is going to them for help is really a remarkable fall from grace for Russia, and a total sign of desperation.
And might that help for the need for help be intensified by the fact there have been strikes on Iran's weapons factories?
Absolutely. Everything is related to everything. So the two countries that are openly supporting Russia in this war are Iran and North Korea. Why are they doing it? Because there's no sanctions that could be greater than the sanctions they're already experiencing. They're both isolated regimes. And so those countries are the ones supporting. And of course, Iran is also supporting Hezbollah and Hamas and so on. And so the Israelis strike on their weapons factories is really a sort of unexpectedly helpful for Ukraine, because hopefully that means that whatever weapons they were supplying aren't going to be supplied, and it's one less thing that the Ukrainians have to worry about. Now, I think that they probably still have military capabilities. It's a big country. There's a lot of people there, a lot of things going on. So I don't think that they're all of a sudden they're out of the game. I mean, I do think the Israelis have done a good job of getting rid of their air defenses and could probably go in there and do some more stuff now that they're sort of free and clear to fly anywhere they want. But at the moment, yeah, sure, it's helpful. It's not the end of the story for Iran helping helping Russia.
And you have often said to me that President Putin only cares about money. How badly do you think his personal fortune is being affected by the war? And how bad does it need to get for him to actually want to end it?
Well, so let me just take you through the psychology of Vladimir Putin. So when he first came to power, he's like every crook that ever is in any position in government in Russia. He went for money. And over a period of time, over 24 years, he accumulated a ton of money. He's probably the richest man in the world. I would say, well north of $200 billion, maybe much higher than that. But that was his initial sort of motivation. However, by stealing all that money, and I should point out that the people around him have stolen probably another 800 billion. If you add it all up, it's $1 trillion of money stolen from Russia over a 24-year period from the Russian people. And what Putin realized at a certain point was that he had stolen too much money. And so by having all that money and the Russian people not having that money, he understood that all it was going to take is like spreading gasoline on the floor, one match and blows the whole thing up. And so the next thing he was concerned about is staying in power, because if he could no longer stay in power, first of all, he would lose all his money, and then he would lose his life. And so it's much more important than money, because there's not a Putin presidential library he can retire to. If he's not in power, they'll string him up from a lamppost like they did Ceausescu, or bayonet him in a tunnel like they did Gaddafi. And so he understands that his whole survival now is dependent on staying in power. And so he's now gravitated from maximizing money to maximizing survival. And so that's what he's concerned about right now, is purely survival. Of course, he's worried about his money, but now it's a much more grave situation. And so basically, he made the mistake of stealing too much money and then creating this situation where he's worried about his own people turning on him.
Mm. On Ukraine itself, the aid measures are secured from the US until the end of the year. We were told by a leading economist who's advised both Ukraine and Russia in the past that an extra $50 billion a year and allowing Ukraine to fire long-range missiles deep into Russia would mean Ukraine could win the war. Do you agree with that?
Well, I'm not sure where the 50 billion number comes from. I think the number is probably higher than that. But the long-range missile number, I completely agree with, that Ukraine, if they can fire long-range missiles, then what they can do is they can destroy the Russian troop formations that are forming inside of Russia. They can destroy the logistics hubs. They can destroy the weapons factories and all sorts of other stuff. And by doing that, they would seriously incapacitate Russia. And the Russians are not very good at war, but they're just brutal and they're ready to throw lots of resources at it. But if the Ukrainians are able to have the freedom of attack, that would be a very good thing to do. And particularly when the Russians are attacking all of Ukraine, why should the Ukrainians be limited on firing back? They can only fire back to Russians inside their own territory. That doesn't make any sense at all. As far as the number goes, I think the number is probably higher than 50 billion. But what I do think is there's an easy solution to this whole thing, which is that when the war started, the West froze $300 billion of Russian central bank reserves. That money is in the custody of the U.S. Federal Reserve, of the European Central Bank, and Bank of England. If that money were to be confiscated outright and handed to Ukraine, that would be the decisive financial blow for Russia, because the Ukrainians could then have whatever resources they need to finish this war. Now, so far, the West has agreed to confiscate the interest on that money, but not the principal. I think they need to go a step further.
And you have been long campaigning for that to happen. Are you getting anywhere?
Well, we got somewhere, which is that they took the sort of baby step of saying, okay, we can confiscate the interest. But we're in a world right now where the West is becoming less and less financially capable to support this war. In Britain, there was a big budget yesterday where they were talking about cutting costs here and cutting costs there, and now we also have Donald Trump potentially as the next U.S. president. He's threatened to cut off funding for Ukraine. There's a lot less Western money available, and so the best way to solve this problem is to let Putin pay for the war to pay the Ukrainians to fight back against him.
And if that doesn't happen, and if the US does decide after the election to cut off all support for Ukraine, can it continue to fight next year?
Well, they're going to have to continue to fight because that's their only choice, is to fight. And what the Ukrainians have shown us is that no matter how dire the predictions are, they somehow are able to survive. You remember the war started, and the Russians had 10,000 tanks, and the Ukrainians only had 1,000, and everybody predicted it would be a 3-day war. And of course, we're now coming in almost to 3 years of this war, and it's nowhere near over. The Ukrainians have also shown that they can make $500 drones destroy $3 million tanks. So I would never count the Ukrainians out, but I think there could be a lot of terrible violence, bloodshed, and disaster and loss if the West stops funding Ukraine's defense against Russia.
Bill, there's an extraordinary legal battle going on right now involving Google, which has reportedly been fined by Russia by more than the world's GDP for blocking pro-Kremlin media outlets. And the Kremlin is also trying to extend its control over the information available in Russia. Apple removing its news apps, and the chat platform Discord recently joined a list of banned apps. Is this more a campaign against controlling the actual information? Is it paranoia? What's it driven by?
Well, basically, Putin can't have the alternative narrative so his narrative is that he's the hero, he's a good man, he's supporting Russia, the Ukrainians are evil, the West is evil, and he should be supported by his people. And of course, the truth is that he's a terrible dictator. He's sending so many hundreds of thousands of his own men to death. He's destroying his economy. But that alternative message is a very unpleasant message that he doesn't want to have delivered. And for the most part, after the war started, he cut off almost every alternative source of information. He shut down Twitter, he shut down Instagram, he shut down all Western news sites. But remarkably, YouTube is still in existence, and a few other bits and pieces. And so, what's more surprising is not that he's fined Google more than the world's GDP. What's surprising is that Google and YouTube actually have survived up until now. But Putin can't have the truth out there, because if he has the truth out there and people were to know who he really is, that they couldn't support that, no matter how much fear they have. And so he's got to get rid of everything, and that this is part of that process.
And how difficult is it for the people in Russia to access the truth?
Well, part of the it's very difficult to access the truth. Some people at the real top end can have historically gotten what's called VPNs, where they can then bypass the Russian internet system and get elsewhere, but they're shutting down on the VPNs. And it's also hard to know the truth, because if everybody around you believes a certain narrative and you believe a different narrative, then you think maybe there's something wrong with you. And that's kind of how it works for the Russian people. And so of course, there's a minority of people that know the truth, but I would guess that a lot of people just either are too lazy or just get caught up in the whole sort of frenzy of violent nationalism, who don't even think about the alternative story, the real what's really going on.
And Bill, finally, before I let you go, I can't do that without flagging up the 10th anniversary of the Magnitsky Human Rights Awards, which are taking place in London on the 14th of November. Can you first, I mean, you spoke about this briefly, mentioned the name at the beginning. Can you tell me about the man in whose name they are awarded and what they aim to do?
Well, thank you for mentioning that. So, what changed my life completely um, was when my lawyer, a Russian lawyer named Sergei Magnitsky, was killed in Russian police custody. I was once the largest foreign investor in Russia, and Sergei was my lawyer, and he discovered a massive corruption scheme in Russia. He exposed it, and for that, he was arrested, tortured for 358 days, and killed. And it changed my life completely. And I went from being a fund manager to being a full-time human rights activist, and started out trying to with the intention of getting justice for Sergei, and it's now morphed into a much bigger campaign. But Sergei was killed on November 16, 2009, which was 15 years ago. And every year on the anniversary of his death, we said, what can we do to remember and honor Sergei? And about 10 years ago, we came up with this idea of creating something called the Magnitsky Award, which is where we would recognize human rights activists, lawyers, opposition politicians all over the world who have stood up to dictatorship and tyranny very bravely and made great sacrifice. And this year we'll be recognizing 7 of these heroes on the 14th of November in London. And every time we do this, I always walk away in awe of the bravery of certain people around the world. And it gives me hope, and it gives me confidence that no matter how hard and how terrible we see things happening, there are forces for good as well as forces for evil out there.
And Bill, I'm delighted to say that we will be meeting together and talking to some of those winners of those awards very soon. And look forward to those going out in special editions of Frontline. Thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you.
You've been watching Frontline for Times Radio with me, Kate Gerbeau. My thanks to our producers today, Louis Sykes and Morgan Burdick, and for you for watching. If you'd like to support us, you can subscribe now, or you can listen to Times Radio for the latest news and in-depth analysis, or go to thetimes.co.uk. For now, though, thanks for watching. Bye-bye.